respect for others, and is expressed through support for so-called fundamental human rights. That's really where it starts, the roots of the whole conversation. I found it quite interesting, before dipping down into specifically AI, to look at what we know about how we do things, how we behave, and I do a little excursus in finding of behavioral psychology, because it could give us a little information on how we actually behave. I took material developed by Professor Christopher Hodges from the University of Oxford that prepared a small report for the UK government back in 2016. And I find it very useful. So, how people make decisions: fairness, proportionality, morality. Well, in the report, it basically says decisions are made by people rather than by organization. Although the structure, systems, objective, culture, and incentive that operate within organization can affect the decision made by the people who work in them. Very interesting sentence. Interesting enough, that was written without thinking of artificial intelligence in mind. So decisions are made by people. Yes. For example, somebody has designed and trained a particular AI system. Somehow a decision is there. Somebody has made a decision how to train an AI, for example. Or suppose that the AI is in reality in control. Think of self-driving cars. Now, in that case, who is making the decision? Well, it all depends on the system. So if the system allows the human to be in the loop, then somebody in the car, a human being, can still make decision. But if you have a completely optimized vehicle that is going on its own, like a drone, that maybe is targeting a particular location without any particular human intervention, decisions are made by people very undoubtedly, because somebody has made the programming and the training and the testing. So you see, this is already an interesting area where it's unclear who is making the decision, which has also lots of not only ethical but also legal implications. Interesting enough, if you look at some of the findings of behavioral psychology, empirical research has found that people obey rules where, number one, the rule corresponds to their internal moral value system. One can wonder, what is a moral value system? Well, it depends on the view of the world. The rule has been made fairly, or at least appear to be fairly made, and the rule is applied fairly. So you see, we're already using terms like fairness that we will be using later on. To continue with this founding of the report, individuals do not need to be familiar with every legal rule. We are not. Even when we sign a contract for buying something, we always we don't really look at some of the regulation, but generally we operate on a kind of broad sense of justice. I put it in italics because justice is a very key part of the whole discussion here. When faced with a particular situation, the individual might draw on example of social norm or custom as a means of guiding social compliance and normative orientation. Well, explained in an easy way is we are always looking at what we think is the norm, social norm. And we try to compare what we are seeing to what we think is social norm. Of course, social norm can change very, very rapidly in society, and also depends on where you are. Continuing with this excursion here, the report continues saying that human behavior is strongly responsive to social influences. People want to conform to the perceived behavior of the people, and that influence can overcome known facts or one's own ideological worldview. Of course, we most of the time we are influenced by role models. We're influenced by what we perceive as people or situations that are important for us. And to some extent, our behavior is affected to that. Marketing knows that very well. That's why you are having a very famous actor or maybe a sport athlete associated to product, because if you associated yourself with a particular hero, then you might be inclined maybe to buy something. That's just an example. But it could go more deeper than that, because it could get into areas such as social, political, economy, where a person or a group of people who influence. It starts from the school, where you have a peer review your group of people. So continue with that, because I close the loop when we talk about AI. Information and loss aversion. People can be influenced by how information is presented or framed. So that information that is vivid and salient can have a larger impact on behavior than information that is statistical and abstract. For example, frame, I'm just want to give you an explanation of this term if you don't know. I can have an information, which is text, and I can have the same information inserted into a picture, or with the picture aside. Now, the picture is basically doing the framing. Now, I can stir your emotion by putting the nice picture of a nice spring, and it gives you the feeling of life and positive. Or I can take the same text and put it together to a picture that is quite depressive. Something happened, or the color is different. And this has an impact on the way we react to this information. You see? So there's not really an objective situation. And people tend to display what they call normally a loss aversion, meaning the people might well dislike losses more than like corresponding gains. Of course, each of us is different, but that's also an interesting thing. People don't want to lose something, and they seem to be more concerned of not losing something rather than what they get. You can turn that by simply changing your behavior and have a kind of gratitude attitude, which changes. But statistically, this is what is happening, that you have that also situation. Another interesting thing, and I found it extremely interesting, because here we talk about probability. People have difficulty in assessing probability. What does it mean, our colleague? People often show unrealistic optimism, might neglect or disregard the issue of probability, especially when strong emotions are triggered, and when emotions are strongly felt, might focus on the outcome and not on the probability that will occur. Now, I have my observation about this. Now, this is just study of behavioral psychology, where we are making the assumption that everything is measurable with probability. Of course, some of us might have another view of the world, where we believe that things don't happen with probability. So this is already two very interesting differences, because when you talk about machine learning and AI, this is all about probability. So the output of a classifier, the output of a prediction, is all about probability. There's no 100% truth, and it's not even something that has to do with some other space. And so judgment about probability are often affected by whether a recent event comes readily to mind. So there's again a memory. The machine have different kinds of situations, they have no memories in that sense. Respect for rules, that's important. People respect for all rules, And for the system, generally will be undermined where they see the rules are not being enforced evenly and fairly. I like that because it has to do with discrimination. And this, again, the two words that you will see, they're recurrent in the literature of AI and ethics. Now, the interesting thing is these are people, and it's a perception of what they see. When the machine is doing something, it has no perception. So if you put a machine learning algorithm to make decision, or at least to supply a decision maker with information, there's not a perception, there is simply probability. So it's changing somehow. So here we come, because the gentleman was commissioned in 2016 to give guidelines to policymakers, so the UK government in that particular case. And the question was really, how can, in that particular case, was focused on business, behave ethically? I would say that you can replace business with anything. You say, how can people behave ethically? How can organization behave ethically? How can society behave ethically? It's the same question. He was basically looking at the businesses, but you can replace this. I like what he says, because he said, well, the requirement is for, and then you can say business or replace it with anything, to adopt an ethical business practices. Practice is opposite to theory. Theory says, oh, I want to be ethical and good. Practice means, let me do something concrete. You can do practice in anything, in everything that is done throughout the organization. Possible, well, codes on individual. So if you look at the single person or individual parts, like, you divide departments, marketing, production, social responsibility, are not enough, because the whole thing is connected. We are all connected. You can see, especially in these days, we are all connected, whether we like it or not. So any approach has to be holistic. Holistic means that you want to take the entire thing into account and not, look in only one particular areas and forget about the rest. Oh, I'm good, I don't care about my neighbor. Or my neighbor is good, but I can do something else. And in organization, he has to go from the top. But then everybody in the organization has to follow. Of course, that would be the same with AI. Studying behavioral psychology have concluded that long-term business success, I like this because, we need to decide what is success, have concluded that it's critical to establish clear core values. And they're shared by all members. Well, interesting that in this report, they use this word, ideology. One has to be very careful. What are these core values? Because it could become an ideology. And if the core values are not rooted in fundamental rights, you can have a very successful business society, successful where successful is defined in various ways, but this is not exactly what we're talking about here. So you see, this is already taking into account that we share core values within a particular view of the world, which is the Western world, with some idea of democracy and some idea of fundamental rights. But then in practice, as we know, not everything is ethical, not everything is legal, not everything is good. So it is essential to provide evidence of trust. And this is a key aspect of also for AI, that an organization operates with ethical value. Well, you can say, I'm good, and you have a nice brochure that claims that my company, my organization, my society is trusted. But that's not enough. You really need to provide mechanism to produce reliable evidence of trust. That could be that at a certain point we will need regulation or certification, or that's why policymakers, lawyers, and consumer advocates are very important in this discussion, as well as philosophers, as well as technical people, as well as all of us. Now, just to conclude on the behavioral part, what happens when something goes wrong? Remember that, because we use this sentence also for AI. When something goes wrong, if that was not intentional, so the people that did something wrong were acting in good faith, it could happen. I did a mistake. So I did a mistake. Nevertheless, I harmed somebody. So there's always a need of defining an appropriate response. Of course, one can, that was only a recommendation here, but you can look at that in the same way when something harm, and you need to understand what is the harm and what is the appropriate response. Failure to do that is very, very bad. Now, this is in good faith. You'll see, there could be an AI that's been trained in good faith, but the prediction is not accurate. And then maybe you get a medical device that says, well, you have a serious disease. The probability is very high. Unfortunately, the training data was biased, and then the classifier was not accurate, or at least not accurate for you. But of course, something goes wrong could also be because people want it to do harm. And you see, here is the word immoral, which means that there is a moral, otherwise there would be no immoral. And again, this is rooted into a system that is always ethical, legal, and society. So you can't really get out of that. And accountability. Who is accountable? If nobody is accountable, if somebody has done harm, one has to enforce some policy. That's why there's a lot of discussion whether AI should be regulated or not. I think the discussion is quite clear. It will be regulated. The question is how. Because regulation is trying to give an appropriate answer, either to remove upfront that, or to simply try to do a remedy. Where sanctions are imposed, the totality of sanctions should be proportionate to the degree of moral culpability involved. That's only a suggestion here. And you see, this is already an ethical situation, tension, because it requires to balance between various factors: social response, reputational and public response, how people react, employment discipline response, civil redress response, regulatory criminal response. So you can place AI in here and you will have the same discussion. So let me go to now our core of the, but that's the opening lecture, but it will be several lectures on various aspects of what's going on when I use artificial intelligence, their benefits and risks. All photos are mine, so if you wonder where they come all these photos, I took them in various occasions. That's a bite for catching fish. So for the fish, that a risk for us is as a benefit. So let me start with something that you might not be expecting when we talk about AI and ethical things. There's something that we call big nudging. Big nudging is a term to manipulate people or society using large amount of data. This could be done on purpose, so is on purpose designed to manipulate people, or it could even be made because people rely so much on data analytics that they're making decisions more based on data rather than on people. So I think here is more about societal and ways of using technology for certain kinds of controlling people. Here is more about how to use technology to make decisions. I just would like to make a comment that one can debate something that is a model that is happening right now in China, And we wrote something back in 2017 where we would basically ask our question, is that really a model to follow? I personally don't think so, but that's happening. So, well, obviously China is not part of a Western society, so they have a different kind of value system. So if we look at specifically AI and look at the first thing, do not harm. It's a classical ethical principle. What if the decision made by using an AI-driven algorithm harms somebody and you cannot explain how the decision was made? Which is very much the case when you start using deep learning, huge amount of parameters, like millions of features. And although the system seems to work, nobody is able to really explain why the decision was made in that way. So then you have a dilemma there, because either I trust something I cannot explain or I don't use it. Maybe if I don't use it, I'm losing the benefit. Maybe it can save life or improve something. At the same time, if I cannot explain, there's a tension there. And that's one of the typical problems that are under the umbrella of tension. Now, let me do a little excursus in machine learning. In machine learning, there's something called bias. People that are experts, bear with me. This is very introductory because I know that in the audience there are also people that have completely different background. But technically, machine learning defines a bias as an error in estimation or over-underrepresenting population when sampling. So I can make an estimation and it's biased because maybe the people are making the estimation are biased and they interpret the output in a particular way, or because the data that was fed into the machine learning did not represent the entire population. For example, suppose that I'm training a classifier that is giving you a prediction of the risk that you might have a heart attack or a cardiovascular disease. So, and the classifier has been trained using a population that was only people from 60 to 80 years old, Caucasian. All right, so there is a problem because the data used for training and testing this classifier does not represent, is certainly underrepresenting the population at large. So it does not represent the age, but it doesn't even represent the ethnicity. So if this classifier is then fed with data that is of, for example, very young people of different ethnicity and Caucasian, Asian, Afro-American, Latino, what happened? So the bias will actually have an impact on the way the machine learning learn. It will learn something out of biased data. And then you have some technical terms, which basically means that your output is biased or probably not correct. Now, there's an interesting example to understand bias in algorithmic design, taken from an interesting source. Suppose two people are tasked with developing a system to sort a basket of fruit. So they need to distinguish between a basket of fruit and they need to distinguish fruits. The task is the following. They have to determine which fruits are high quality. Look, high quality. Those high quality will be sold at the market for money. And the one that they think are poor quality, they will be sent to a factory for making jam. Now, the question is probably making less money, or probably this is making more money because it's high quality. Now, high quality is not defined, at least not in this task. So what happened is, suppose you have two people, and two people with different backgrounds, with different education, with different perception of what high quality fruit is, They are tasked to perform the same task, same basket of fruit. What you get is very likely different results. For example, suppose that, let's say me, which is not really true, but let's say one person, I don't put names, believes that high quality in fruit is the fruit is very, very bright color, red or green, really good. And you think that's high quality. So that he might say, well, every fruit in my basket that is very colorful is a good thing. I put it in the market. And anything that doesn't look like very colorful, I put it to the jam factory. So he might send strawberries, very rare, to the market, and melons that are not that really colorful to the jam factory. At the same time, the other person that is working exactly on the same basket, but in a copy, thinks that it's not the color that really matters, but it's the shape. It has to be perfect. An apple should be perfectly polished. That's high quality. If there is some kind of scruffy thing on the outside, it's not good. So this person could probably send unripe strawberries to the market and maybe ripe melons or bananas to the jam factory. Although maybe bananas in jam factory are pretty good. So what are the consequences of that? So similarly, logical and evenly applied criteria will result into different outcomes from the same basket fruit. So here you have a funny situation. In one thing to say, well, this algorithm is marginalized melons or unfairly stored cucumbers. Okay, so you may be losing some money, or the cucumbers cannot really say, I'm sorry, I've been treated badly. But what happens when the same principle is applied to make decisions about people? That's a completely different situation. Here, just an example. You can have algorithm based on AI or machine learning for reviewing loans application, recruit new employees, assess potential customers, or, and I think is even more important, if you go up to the level of risk in healthcare, any device that uses AI for predicting diseases, diagnosis, or prognosis. If the data used is biased or skewed, the decision might actually be inaccurate or could be discriminatory against certain category groups. So suppose that the guy that has trained the review loan application fed on the example of good people that are people with a high income. Every time somebody comes with a low income, it will be rejected. So that you can say, well, I'm discriminating in this category. If you don't disclose the algorithm, there's no transparency. There's a different kind of bias. You see, you start having an interesting definition of bias. It's not only the bias of the data, but it's also the effect of the bias. There's something written in a journal article called allocative harm. The bias is harming because a system allocates or give or withholds, does not give a certain opportunity or resource to a certain class of people because they are high risk. That's a very big situation for Afro-American in the United States, where this is really withholding in hospital, for example, because maybe they have a low income. Or there's another kind of harm coming from bias, which is called representation harm, when a system reinforces the subordination of subgroups along the line of identity. Expressed in the easier way, meaning the AI is reinforcing some prejudice. We think that this class of people are low income and they are criminals. So my system will basically make sure that I am continuing this with decision. This is a big discussion in when we discuss about AI injustice, for example, if it's used in courts or not. In the States, there were cases again where classes of people, most of the time with race and ethnicity, were discriminated because the AI was trained by using mainly Caucasian white people examples. Now, here is a couple of definitions for those of you that are not familiar with that. In the two terms that I'm interested in here is one is called false positive, and the other one is false negative. False positive is an error in the data reporting in which a test, it could be a prediction or whatever, you predict if somebody has a disease or not, result improperly indicating the presence of a condition. For example, a disease. Such a disease, so the result is positive, in reality is not present. That's why it's called false. So you basically say to somebody, look, I think you have a risk of a heart attack, but in fact you don't have. So there's a false prediction. The other one is more subtle because it's called false negative. It's an error in which the test result improperly indicating not present a condition. For example, you don't have any problem, you have no disease, but in reality you have a problem. These two things are very important because when it comes to prediction, you will very likely start looking at accuracy by looking how many of these and how many bits you have. And that's the way we define accuracy. We're trying to reduce this and that, but since no system is perfect, you have a probability that something happens. But the individual doesn't care about probability. When somebody says, you're good, okay, I did my test, the AI tells me I don't have any cardiovascular problem. I go to the gym, I die of a heart attack. Who's responsible? Me, the person that gave me the device, the doctor that was telling me to look at that, the advertisement agency that said, look at that. And so these are important situations. And what is very important here that AI is never on its own, it's always in context. And the context in AI gives a level of harms. So the overall potential damage or harm that an AI system might cause in its use depends on the context. Now, at the end of my lecture, I will allow you to send me chats with questions or comments. We will have some conversation at the very end, beside for the student giving you opportunity to ask something about your credit points. But look at this quote. I read the quote for you, and the question is, this is a real quote from an interview from a German data scientist that at that time was working in a advertisement agency in the States, but she's a data scientist. So she was targeting ads with machine learning. And she said, provocatively, of course, what happens if my algorithm is wrong? Someone sees the wrong ad. What's the harm? So what's the harm? And then she immediately compared, it's not a false positive for breast cancer. Do you agree with this quote? Now, this is the typical things that is not an ethical question, but you could say, what is harm? Of course, it's not a false positive for breast cancer means the AI is used in the context of healthcare. Healthcare has to do with people, with your health. And this is really something that goes to the core fundamental rights. If a system is doing something that is doing harm to you, this is a high risk. So we should try to avoid having a system where you rely on that. Now, but if you look at this with the marketing, and if you think of the big nudging that we discussed it before, where data is being misused for other things, that's also kind of harm that is not obvious because it's not clearly defined. So there's a lot of discussion in these days in regulators to decide what is the level of risk of various AI. So you could say marketing with a target, a recommendation, is not as a risky business as when somebody is looking for screening for cancer. And then you can decide if you want to regulate more the higher risk class of AI versus the one that should be low risk. Unfortunately, this is really debatable because somebody has to make a decision. What is the scale of risk? And risk goes over time, which is something that makes an AI system completely different than me try to sell you a fridge. I can sell you a fridge, a nice fridge. There is energy consumption, there's a labeling, and it said, this fridge is great. It will consume very little electricity. And you put a label like green. You're very happy, you buy a sustainable fridge, which is being approved by some kind of regulators and a stamp. Now, 3 years later, nobody's going to go in your house and checking if your fridge is consuming a lot of energy, because there's not a law that says you have to bring the fridge to check. But there's a law that says you have to bring your car to do a check every 1 year, 2 years, and you do certain kind of checks. You see, it's all about the law, the context. Somebody said, well, a car that is not safe might do more harm than the fridge that has a leak. You see, this is basically where we are moving here. Now, and this is something you're probably going to see during the series of course, concept building. What does it mean? When you start talking about what is good and bad, and you talk about technology, for example, AI, and people have different background, different culture, different businesses, different terminology, immediately you see the one important obstacle to make any progress on ethical and societal issues raised by AI system is that terms are ambiguous and used in different ways. The 3 parts, some terms have an overlapping, technological overlapping. They have different meaning between discipline. They have different meaning between culture and people. This is taken from this very interesting article that is listed in our website. These numbers are always listed in our website in terms of literature, and you can download the report. I'm taking from that report. This is an example of terminology overlap between bias, fairness, and discrimination. So the terms bias, fairness, and discrimination are very often used to refer to problems involving data sets and or algorithms, which in some way disadvantage certain individuals or groups. That's basically a cluster of meaning. But it's not really clear that all cases referred to by this system involve the same type of problem. For example, a social scientist called Barocas, very famous, has distinguished 3 kinds of concern when an algorithm is making a decision and under the term discrimination. So basically it's looking at how an algorithm is making an output, and this output can be used in a way that is discriminating somebody. It is a first cases where deployers, so the machine learning people that did the software, deliberately attempt to disadvantage certain user. So that was really done on purpose and make it this difficult to detect. For example, hiding the critical bit of code within a complicated algorithm. This is crime, but it also depends on if this is accepted in the system or this is actually a crime. So it always has to do with the context and the domain. That's the one case. Second case, cases where the machine learning produce errors which disadvantage certain user. For example, due unreliable input data. So the input data was crap. It wasn't good quality, and the machine learning was trained with bad data. Nobody really filtered this data. Or even worse, whoever was using this AI look at the output and draw faulty inference from the output of this and make a decision that is discriminating to people. Also, not easy to detect because it has to do with man-machine interaction. How do people become influenced by the output of an algorithm? Third case, where an algorithm enhances decision makers' ability to distinguish and make differential decisions between people. For example, allowing them to more accurately identify and target financially vulnerable individuals for further exploitation. Well, one can turn it the other way around and say, if this would be not discrimination, you can target weak people to help them. So that would be the good part. But if you're targeting people that are weak to exploit them, that's discrimination. And again, it depends on who designed the algorithm, who's using it, and what is the entire context of that. And it could be unethical to discriminate certain class of people only because, for example, they don't have certain opportunity. Another example of differences between discipline, that was different in terminology, now different between discipline, bias. We talk about bias from a statistical meaning. So in statistics, a bias sample means a sample that does not adequately represent the distribution of features in the reference population. For example, it contains a high proportion of young men than in the overall population, or is only Caucasian people and there are no other example of ethnicity. So that's the statistical bias. Of course, it has an implication on the machine learning. But if you are, and some of you are, in law or social psychology, the term bias has a different meaning, is a connotation of a negative attitude or prejudice towards a particular group. So that's interesting because if two people start talking, the machine learning guy said this data set is unbiased in the statistical sense. So for him, it's the end of the check. But nevertheless, for these other people, these unbiased data sets might encode or contain common biases in the social sense towards certain individual social groups. You see, this is really becoming very difficult because you have levels of abstraction and level of expertise that are completely different. Again, this is also taken from the same report. So when you start having a team that has to make a decision, is this AI good or bad, and have different expertise, a different background, because otherwise you cannot really operate, you need to start assembling a dictionary of meanings and concepts and try to match them in a way that you agree so that you don't crosstalk, rather, but you talk. Crosstalk in American or in English means that you don't really talk to each other. One is talking in one way, the other one, and you don't really communicate the same meaning. If I say bias and the two people mean something different, then you never really communicate. You miscommunicate. And the third obstacle is differences in culture and publics. Publics, you never heard about it. I'll tell you why, because it's taken from this article. So when we go and look at the ethical values, key concepts might be understood differently or carry different connotation across different cultures. And publics in this report means they invented this word because normally you have public, but they put an S. Is a plural to emphasize different interest groups, scientists, mediators, decision makers, activists, etc., to bring their own distinct perspective, lobbyists as well. So when we talk about scientists, we did our own experience because we are working on for almost a year on an interdisciplinary project on assessing a medical device in AI. And I was amazed, as always, by seeing all of us, depending on our expertise, we are locally closed, meaning when somebody talks to somebody else of another discipline, different terminology, sometimes no willingness to listen because it's all already done, and difficulty in communicating and bringing back information that could be really useful. Because we are all in silos. The lawyers talk in a way, the engineers talk in a way, the policymakers talk in a way, the medical doctors talk in a way, the public health talk different than the cardiologists. And so you become to realize that we are islands of pseudo expertise that are not really sharing. Sometimes because they don't want, sometimes because they can't. That makes things extremely difficult. And lobby is another thing. You might have different interests and opinions, and motivation. Here's an example of differences across culture and publics. So privacy. Privacy is one of those topics that becomes emotional because some people become extremely emotional, other people don't care. Beside that, if you look at from the view world, so from a Western ethical tradition, so for example, if you look at Kant, but we will have this in the next lecture, so I'm not going to be giving you a lecture on ethics because that's not really what I'm here supposed to do. But the Western ethical tradition tend to conceive individual privacy as an intrinsic good, individual. That's why we have also economy that are kind of strongly individual based. Now, the same concept might not work if you take other tradition, for example, Eastern tradition. This is not interesting because this was written in 2019, and the quote is in Confucianism, so that is basically Eastern, tend to emphasize the collective good over the individual. So that's already an interesting frame. So if your view of the world is here or here, as a completely different thing. And of course, this view of the world also develops in political, economical view and ecosystem. So, and the notion of individual privacy as opposed to the collective privacy has less attention in this tradition anyway, and it might even be negatively collateralized. Of course, this is nothing to do with politics of democracy, not democracy, but obviously the view of the world is different here than in our Western world. Or, this is another quote from the same article that said traditional Buddhism regards the belief in autonomous self as an illusion, and therefore they basically try to avoid the lack of self. The lack of self is actually the opposite of the individual in the Western tradition. So when it comes to privacy, you might have surprisingly different attitude of people, not only because it's an emotional topic, but because it's a different culture. So how do you agree on something? It has to do with the context. So let's move forward. Our first hour is finished. When we have a team of AI or machine learning, a team does not only have to be engineers, could be everybody who is in the team making decision between programming and using it or deciding where to use it. And this team is too homogeneous. Now, homogeneous is basically connected to what we discussed before, same culture or same race or same age or whatever. Suppose that you have a team of young Caucasian people under 22, and they're all software engineers, and they're all in a startup. They're going to start thinking in one dimension. And this could be potentially create a bias and unwanted discrimination because the people, they think in one way and they don't even consider other opportunity. This is very, we're all human, and we tend to, remember when we discussed about the behavioral results of psychology, we tend to conform. So if my group appears is everybody between 22 and 25. I'm in a startup. That's my peers. I might do decision and thinking that is in good faith, not necessarily in bad faith, potentially wrong, or potentially I don't take into account classes of people that because I don't really see them. I believe that in these days of great challenges, you'll see a lot of interesting situations emerge in society. But this has nothing to do with AI, so I'll move forward. If we look at the AI, there's a bunch of things that one has to know about it, even if you're not technical, because it's important. That at the moment, even the most complicated deep neural networks that are recognizing, for example, objects. Suppose you are in a self-driving cars and there is a car that is coming in front of you. This is really a school bus. It's not a car. So the AI sees this and recognize with one that this is a school bus. Good. But suppose that, for an out of distribution input, meaning the system has been trained with pictures of a school bus that look mostly like this one here. But in real life, it could be that you have snow, for example, here, slippery, and the school bus, unfortunately, went out of the road, and then the eye sees this, or see this, or see that. We know it's still a school bus that had an accident. The AI think is a garbage truck. Why? Because, it doesn't understand. He just simply look at pixel here and he sees something that resembles something that looks like a garbage truck, but the reality is a school bus. So that's really, there's an article, Strike with the Pose. If you want to follow that, you can then in the slides click and go there to get the technicality. This is really what happened in real life. But the AI has not the capacity of understanding that because it's been trained, given millions of pictures of what it thinks is something. So this has to do with safety, because if he thinks it's something else, he might react in a way you don't want. So that's part of that. And these are not bad intention, just a natural non-adversarial input. Just happened that the school bus as in this situation. And this is some other example here. But it could be, and this is called AI attacks, that you could have so-called adversarial example. So most of the machine learning models, including neural networks, most of the time misclassify, they don't get the right output. When they receive an input on purpose to make the results wrong. There's again an article here that gives you the technicality, but ultimately, if this is a panda and you give on purpose, so this is not real life, but it's on purpose. Somebody wants to make the AI making a wrong decision or classification. You add some input that is done in a particular way so that the end, the output, when you receive this picture is completely different because you have attack. And again, this is scary to the point that suppose that in the future you will have your fridge, talking about the fridge, is interconnected with internet, with intelligent sensors. Sensor will be giving information to an AI, and the AI will make the best maintenance of your fridge for you. The AI is then attacked. And then you can think of all these embedded AI in cars, in devices, in pipelines for oil or maintenance, being attacked on purpose. So you can think about it, of the consequences if that happens. Especially there's something called Internet of Things where everything is connected. So that could be quite bad. I give you an example, which is autonomous cars. There's a lot of work on autonomous cars. So let's consider an autonomous car that relies entirely on an algorithm that had taught itself to drive by watching a human do it. At the moment, we don't really have that allowed standard on the road, but there are examples and work on that, as you know. What happened if one day the car crashed into a tree, or unfortunately happened, kill somebody? You probably are familiar with a year and a half ago, there was a case that was related to Uber, and I call it the Uber case. Uber is the service where the normal service is actually everybody is driving a car, is basically offering the service like a taxi, but Uber is working on self-driving cars. And here we're talking about the prototyping of Uber self-driving cars. I call it the Uber case for false positive for plastic bags. There's been an accident. Unfortunately, somebody died because the self-driving car killed a person. And there was a quote in 2018, also mentioned in a very serious journal in Germany, which basically says the following: the car sensors detected a pedestrian that happened in the evening. And this pedestrian happened to be a homeless. And this pedestrian was crossing not a street, but it was crossing a highway. So normally you don't cross the highway with a bicycle. But, there was a homeless. So there was totally a non-standard input. And Uber had the self-driving software, which was a complex set of neural network, did not react, and the car killed the person. Now, we wonder, how come this happened? Well, that's actually what happened afterwards. After 1 year, the US made an investigation, and now the case has been kind of closed. Now, the bits of the things that are interesting is that the software was designed on purpose to try to avoid as much as possible false positives. What does it mean? Well, a false positive, as you said, if you remember our definition, is something that is an indication that there's a problem, but you don't have it. So, for example, suppose that the car sees an object on the street, but this object is a plastic bag. So if you're driving yourself and you are conscious that this is a plastic bag, what do? You basically don't stop. You go over the plastic bag, because if you will need to stop every time there's a plastic bag on the street, the car will never drive. So the engineers, for all kinds of reasons, and we don't want to speculate, because if you start speculating, you put a narrative, you put something that is not factual. But they tune the neural network, because you can tune them by setting a threshold for what they think is false positive. Now, if the system thinks that this is not really a problem, and it does not understand that that's a person because probably the light was not good, then the system is not reacting properly. Now you might wonder, how come the car killed the person? Who was in the car? Well, the interesting thing is that normally in these experiments, there would be a person in the car watching the self-driving car, and so human in the loop, and it's supposed to be basically taking control if the car is doing something wrong. Very good. There was a person in the car. Unfortunately, this person was not paying attention. the person was watching a movie on Netflix on her smartphone. And by the time she realized that the car was hitting the person died. So unfortunately, this is probably the first case of an AI killing a person. Since he was a homeless, and homeless normally have no family, nobody sued the company because there was no family. So this is the case that obviously let you think that there's a lot of regulation and needs of understanding and when would be safe to have a self-driving car on the road. Still, Uber restarted working on self-driving cars. Google is working on self-driving cars. We might have self-driving cars, and that's also an example. The interesting thing is and this is a quote from a computer scientist in 2018 that is saying, well, machine learning is learning from the data. So that's how machine learning is working. So you don't program it to do something, you program it to learn. And he's basically making a case and say, okay, what happened if you have a car? We don't have the car in this way at the moment like that, but suppose that this car is learning to drive by watching a person driving. Now, this is not the case at the moment. At the moment, the case is that somebody, the designer, the machine learning engineers, are feeding video of human drivers to the software in order to make the software learning. So I'll give you a use case which is real. But before that, I need to make a case here, which is very important, which is why machine learning or AI in general has limits. It's called causality. Causality, and that's a very good quote from one of the father of AI. Causality means understanding why something happens. And at the moment, causality is very important because we as human beings, we have what he calls a good causal model of the world, meaning that when something unfamiliar happens, you are able to react because you know why. You know, the school bus is in this position because the snow is slippery. Ooh, it's difficult. I know it's a school bus. Or somebody is doing something not properly on the road. I know how to react. Machine don't have that. Machine don't know why. This is really one of the major limitations. So how do we do that? Machine don't know why. So how do I train a machine? Because I cannot tell you why. Let me give you a real example. This is taken from 2 papers, and then I also talked to one of the designers. Waymo is a company that belongs to Google and is one of the top company in the States developing technology for self-driving cars. Waymo belongs to Alphabet. Alphabet is a mother company of Google. And they have, in 2018, created a recurrent neural network for driving. Since this is a course on ethical and not on technical space, the interesting thing is they train the neural network imitating the good and synthesizing the bad. So here's the key. You have a system and you have to tell the system, what does it mean good driving? What does it mean bad driving? Let's start with the good. So who is deciding what is good? Well, somebody, if there's not a law that tells you how to define good, somebody might have probably a catalog of a good driving means you don't go faster than the speed limit, you stay on the lane, so you don't crisscross, you only overcome from right to left if you are in a certain country, and etc., etc. But in reality, the definition of good is not well defined, as well as the bad. Of course, the bad is you don't want the people trash another car or kill somebody, go under a bridge or go under a tree. But again, bad. What is bad? So let's see how they did it. The good, okay, somebody has to make a decision and feed to the software example of expert driving. Now, what is an expert driving? Again, an expert driving is somebody who has a license for more than 25 years? Don't think so. He might have done a lot of accidents. An expert driving is somebody that never reported an accident in the insurance company for the last 10 years. Doesn't mean he's a good driver. So anyway, what they do, they train the model with example of video of about 60 days of expert driving. So the system has received millions of videos of 60 days of expert driving in order to understand what does it mean to do good driving. And then I was asking myself, how do they know what is bad driving? Then I asked the designer because there was nothing on the paper. So I had a personal communication with the designer, who was no more at Waymo, but at that time he was there. And he said, well, it's difficult to feed bad examples. What does it mean? Well, they do not find bad example in real life because somebody will need to look for them. So what they do in the training, synthesize bad examples. So they create their own bad examples. So somebody has to start thinking all possible bad ways of driving, which is kind of a challenge because think about it, and feed them to this neural network and add in a so-called training loss so that the system will understand that, if he does that, he has a loss, so he shouldn't do it. So that's the learning part. Real example of bad behavior difficult to intentionally obtain, and is simpler and safer to synthetically create bad example in simulation. Well, we can discuss about that, whether it's simpler or safer, but that's really a quote from a key engineers in machine learning. So that gives you an idea of the level where we are when these people, this is a great guy, where these people, they have to make decisions. And there's no law. So again, this is taken again from their paper. They also say it would be great to know why an expert driving is driving in that way in contrast to a bad driver, because then we could learn. The problem is, and that is actually, again, the same problem, that you cannot do it because the system is only working on the statistical model. So I ask, but how do you make a distinction between good and bad? And this is his answer, and he said, disclaimer is my view, is no more a Waymo, but he said, well, as a common person, if I look at that, he was thinking, well, distinguishing between something has intelligence and not, making an ethical decision or not, for him, it was like having kind of a Turing test scenario. For those of you who are not familiar, that's in computer science very known. And basically, if you do that, you will be able to become as good as an individual, basically say in a very easy way. The problem is that since the system does not understand, what you have to do is basically to feed the system with so much data that it will try to represent all possible situations. So the machine learning does not learn and generalize like us. So basically what they need to do is basically take the data and include so-called long-tail scenarios. A long-tail scenario basically means if you have a situation that occur very often, the system will react properly. But there's always something that occurs very rarely, almost never, at the long tail, so at the end of the tail. And if you don't tell the system this is happening, it will never know. And when this happens, the system will not react properly. That's why, at present, in order to train this neural network, they need a huge amount of data to cover all possible situations that goes wrong. And this is a challenge, and this is almost one of the things that makes self-driving car, for me, a very interesting example of something that you can think about. If you have a drone, the situation gets even more interesting, because the drone will go on its own and will do something. So the thing is, who is setting the examples? Now, this is a scenario that we don't have yet, but let's suppose that you are buying a car in the future that is a self-driving car, and the car is not only learning in the factory when the software has been produced, but also is learning by watching you driving, like a self-adaptive driving. Of course, we don't have it at that moment, but suppose that. And suppose that the car is learning your style. Now, we are not always good drivers, right? So the car might learn something good, or it might learn something less good. And suppose there is a situation where the car is harming something or somebody. The software, who's responsible? Because the software learned by you, or it was trained differently. So you see, these are all scenarios that will come in the moment where this kind of system will be part of our daily life. So let me go to AI and policymakers. So what do? Policymakers, they set rules. And the European Commission, for example, or other institution or regional, local, they try to regulate and put framework. So of course, AI is in their goal. By the way, this, if you wonder what it is, this is the in Venice last year, there was an art exhibition called Biennale, very famous. And this was a piece of art of an artist that will determine the future of communication between human beings. It's funny because if you put Zoom here, then that's basically how we're doing today. We're not face-to-face, we are communicating in that way. Policymakers and AI. Now, look, this is a guy, he's a Director General of the European Commission, and he's talking about AI from his perspective. I put in bold things that are important. So he looks at people, citizen, I look at business, and he said, people and business alike need to be able to trust the technology. Remember what we talked about at the very beginning about behavioral psychology? Same stuff. You have to trust. But you need to make some kind of evidence that you can trust. So this is one very important recurrent problem. Second, in order to trust, you would like to have transparency. I would like to know what's going on in the app, which is not always possible. If it's not possible, there's a tension with trust. And then they would like to minimize, and here is interesting because this gentleman is talking minimizing the risk of bias. The interesting question would be, what kind of bias is he talking about? He's very likely talking about the bias from the domain perspective, because it's not technical. So he's probably talking about discrimination, fairness, and these are the keywords that are associated here, and you will see in the course of other lectures here. And this understanding has to do with transparency. If I don't see, it's difficult. Sometimes you don't even understand even if you see. And you might not even trust even if you see and you understand. So you see, this is a very interesting chain, and they have something they would like to have called explainable AI. This is what they would like to have. Whether this is doable is another story. So the EU has been working on what they call high-level expert group to define an AI that you can trust. They call it trustworthy artificial intelligence. Very good. Bunch of experts. They need to agree. All experts have their own background, their bias, and they come up with 3 elements I think are reasonable. The AI should be lawful, respecting laws and regulation. But at the moment, there are no specific laws and regulation for AI. So then that's an interesting gap. So laws have to catch up on technology. Has to be ethical, respecting, and here is all about our course. Ethical principles and values. What are these? How do I measure? How do I enforce them? And it has to be robust. So for the engineers, finally we can, have a little break because we go on the technical part. We can measure parameters because the engineers, like me, like to measure. Is fair? Oh yeah, I have a measure of fairness. And there's plenty of work in this area. But the fact that it's robust doesn't mean it's ethical. And remember, legal and ethical are different things. I can be totally legal and do something unethical. But if it's something totally wrong, it's very likely that there's an impact on legal because accountability. So they are all connected to each other. Very complicated because all of these 3 are from different domains and different expertise. An AI is placed in domains, so it's not one AI. Anyway, so they come up with something important for our course. We are in the EU, so Western democracy. They rooted their work in ethical principles that are based on fundamental rights. Nothing new, but for those of you who are not familiar with that, normally you have the 3 are well-known: respect of human autonomy, prevention of harm, fairness. If some of you is familiar with biology or genetics or medicine, there's a code of ethics, and they're all in that area here. What they did, this group of people, including also philosophers, they add the 4th one, which doesn't exist. It's called explicability. Because this is the attempt to give a value to explanation. Explanation doesn't have to be transparency. I can explain something without showing something, and transparency is not the same as explicable. And again, when you say explicability, it depends to whom and how you explain. But these are so-called principles, ethical principle, and my colleague Emmanuel Goffi will be in the next lecture tomorrow, surely talking about ethics and principles. So I'm glad that he comes after me because he will give you the solid background. I think he's in the audience. I saw his name. So hello, Emmanuel. But this, when it comes to practice, they produce so-called tension. Tension between principle and example. Consider an example, the use of an AI system for predictive policing. Well, policing is really the police, which might help reducing crime. Predicting if somebody will do a crime, so I go and catch the guy before he does a crime. But to do that, the system has to do some face recognition or surveillance in the street. And this could be against individual liberty and privacy. You see privacy, depending on the meaning of privacy in the context and culture, in some places this could be no problem. In other places there will be no go. And this is really where it gets complicated. So ethical tensions, this is taken again from here. We use this umbrella term to refer to different ways in which values can be in conflict. So, in this example, reduce crime is a value. The tension is against individual liberty and privacy. So then I have a problem here, because which one I choose? And when we talk about tension between value, we mean the tension between the applicability of different values in technological application rather than the things in abstract way. So like in this example, this technology is reducing crime, but you have a price to pay. Which one do you want? Is it good? That's actually all about our course, is to give you some enough framework information to have a discussion about cases like this. They're very practical, and they will come every day. Of course, AI just won't happen, and you happen to have this specific, but for any other technology, these three are valid as well. So here is, taken from this paper, some example of tension between values. You might agree, you might not agree with some of them. You might add your own. Maybe Emmanuel will have different opinion or different tension, but it's interesting to see what some people in policymakers, this is a recommendation of this foundation, Nuffield Foundation in Cambridge. They did it last year. Quality of service, that's one value, versus privacy. For example, suppose you have a AI or software that is using personal data to improve public services by tailoring them based on personal characteristic or demographic quality. But the price, you might have a problem with personal privacy, because the system that improved that wants to know more. Where are you, for example? I mean, if you're using your phone or other devices and you have activated Google Maps is a great service because it gives you all kinds of information about restaurants, hotels, all kinds of good things. It might actually use some of the data, where are you, and stuff like that. If somebody is really concerned about that, then he has a problem here. If somebody is more happy about this, it will value this more, and there's a tension. If you have to make a decision for everybody, shall I use this for a community? Shall I allow him or not? The other one is called personalization versus solidarity. Increasing personalization of services and information might bring economic individual benefits, but risk creating or furthering division and undermining community solidarity. For example, in a situation like now, where we have shut down in many countries and schools are mainly closed, or at least they're reopened in some places, but they're mainly closed, you can have a personalization by having a Zoom lesson, but it might be that in certain family that are of weak status and they have no technology, they cannot really catch up on that. So basically, you're offering something that is good, but you are basically undermining community solidarity, because then the people that are not that well off, they are worse off. So, and again, that's a dichotomy that we have here. And of course, you can see any kind of application in that space. Convenience versus dignity. At the beginning, I said what it is, didn't understand. And I said increasing automation and quantification could make lives more convenient. Yes. What is the problem with that? But risk, because there's always a risk, undermining those unquantifiable values and skill that constitute human dignity and individuality. I say, oh, wow, that's very general, but still is very important, but it's not very precise. What is convenient and what is human dignity? There you get into situation where to decide whether there's a tension in this space is subject to a lot of discussion. Much easier, this one here, privacy versus transparency. the need to respect privacy or intellectual property might make it difficult to provide full satisfying information about an algorithm or the data that was trained. That's a big problem with intellectual property, because if you have an AI where the inside is under intellectual property, so it's secret, you cannot explain, and at the moment you are not able to have a qualified opinion whether the output is correct or not. That's also a tension between the two. And again, this is also something that happens. Accuracy versus explainability is the same thing. You might have a system, an AI, that is working very well, but you don't really know how to explain the results, but it seems to work very well, like it's detecting lung cancer pretty nicely, maybe sometimes better than the doctor. But if somebody is asking, how did he do it? You cannot give an explanation because it's too many parameters. So then what do you want? A system that you can explain, or a system that works well? This is really an ethical tension, because it has an implication on doctors, patients, insurances. Whoever make a decision here is really important. Accuracy versus fairness. I have a system that seems to work very well for a class of people. Unfortunately, it doesn't work well for other classes. So fair means, what does it mean, fair? That's also a term that is not unique. There's a lot of philosophical principle to define what fairness means, and for each one you have a different implication. And so again, there's a tension here, and this is really one that is strongly in practical devices that are used in AI at the moment. There's a couple more. I go maybe more fast here. Satisfaction of preferences versus equality. And again, maybe by using certain technology, some class of people are well off, but others, they become even more poor. So it's a concentration of power. And efficiency versus safety and sustainability. So here you get really into a space where the tension are less technical. As you can see, sustainability means a lot of stuff. So it really depends on what you mean with sustainability. Sustainable in which way? In the ecological sense, in the business sense, in the personal sense. And again, one has to make concept building to define the meaning in order to make this tension clear. That's taken from this paper. What I really like is the kinds of tension they classify. They decide, okay, they have tension, but this tension can be classified in three kinds. True ethical dilemma. And I'm sure Emmanuel will talk about a classical dilemma. I go left, I kill a child. I go right, and I kill two adults. I cannot go straight. So there's nothing, there's no technical, there's no solution that helps me to make a decision. It's an ethical dilemma. What do? I cannot stop. I have to go left and right. And both in this situation, I don't want to have them. This is a true dilemma. And how to resolve that requires a completely different way of doing that, because it will require involving people that take the responsibility to decide. The other one is dilemma in practice, meaning, okay, the tension is not really there, but it is there because either the current technology is not capable of doing, or I have a constraint. I don't have enough time, I don't have enough resources. It's too expensive to look for all possible solution. I have to make a decision between two alternatives. And the third one is now an ethical dilemma. It's so what they call false dilemmas, where basically there is a third option, but we don't see it at the moment. When there's a third option, there's no more tension between two. I found it very interesting, this classification. I would be very interested to see if we can classify real example in these three categories. So the AI has this concept of trustworthy AI, and I go fast because they have requirements. And these requirements are rooted in human rights. There are 7. Human agency and oversight. You see, they're very general, so including fundamental rights. Technical robustness, safety. This is easier for engineers because they would like to have an AI that is good, protected by attacks, and secure and accurate. Privacy and data governance. In EU, we have even a law that is related to that, so you should respect that. Transparency is very complicated because explainability is not a given fact. These are requirements that are not law. It's just what they would like to have. Diversity, non-discrimination, and fairness. Again, very general. As you see, there are different meaning of that. Bias. Societal and environmental well-being. Well-being is another key factor. What is well-being? And I think we'll have a lesson, the third lesson that has really the focus on well-being. Is AI something that can improve our well-being? And accountability, which is obviously related to also responsibility, and basically who's responsible if something goes wrong, or when do we need to redo something that went wrong, so-called redress. Okay, that's a picture they have. I go fast. I think we're all responsible. That's basically my observation. And I'm finishing before going to the part for the credit points with this extremely nice quote from a colleague that says, what is really AI? We as people are not always behaving in an ethical way. That's our human characteristic. So there's good and bad. So when AI is learning by observing us, how do we control it? And this is really the interesting question that obviously has no answer. Maybe this will force us to confront ourselves on what we really mean by ethics before we can decide how we want AI to be ethical. This is a nice quote. With this is basically the end of my content of the opening lecture. I'm thanking you for that. And I like to give some practical information for those people that in the audience wants or need to have credit points. So first of all, this is a series of lecture. So we turn it into a series of lecture with invited speakers of different disciplines. The course will offer a series of lecture covering a variety of topics, high level to technical, so ethics, moral value, humankind, trust, fairness, discrimination, transparency. So everything that we saw, and also something in specific domain like healthcare, legal experts. This is the schedule that you will see in our website. So this is the first lecture. The second will be done tomorrow by my colleague Emmanuel Goffi. Then there will be every week 2 lectures on Wednesday and Thursday, always from 2 to 4. And you have the schedule and you have the name of the speaker. And it will finish the 18th of June. Now, as you saw, the course starts at 2 p.m. sharp, but you can let's say, come before so that you are in the list. For all the people who register prior to each lecture, you will receive by email a link. So next lecture, that is tomorrow, you will receive today a link for tomorrow's lecture. So it's not the same with this lecture. It's always at 2 o'clock to sharp to maximum 4 p.m. Everything is in English. For students, especially for our university, you get 6 credit points. These are the names of the modules that you can place our course. Everybody can attend. students of any kind. And also, as you see, the course is open to also people who are interested. And the communication, especially for students with us, is with this email. So the email that you can see here is a way where we interact with you. For those people, for those students that have been registered before April the 20th, Todo Ivanov, who is working in our team, has created a Google Doc. A Google Doc is a shared document for each student that will be sent by Todo by email. And then you will have, every week, assignments, individual assignments. So each student individually will read one selected repo or paper, and you have the link with the PDF, and you will have to answer 2 questions in written form. For each question, satisfactorily answer, you get 1 point. In order to get your final credit points, you need to have at least 7 points. What does it mean? You receive every week 1 paper to read with 2 questions. You have 1 week time to produce the answer. So 1 week to the next Wednesday at 8 a.m. If you don't submit your answer, you don't get points. And we, so me and Todo, have 1 week to correct the answer, and you get the answer corrected in your Google Doc. Answer to question. So in written form, English only, because all the material is in English. So minimum half a page text, maximum 1 page text per question. You can optionally add half a page of figures or whatever you like. Always quote the source. So if you take anything that comes from some place, make sure that you quote the source. If you do copy and paste without quoting the source, you don't get a credit points in general, which is really ethical, because it really has to do with assuring that we know what is coming from you. And if you're taking a quote, which is great, but make sure that we know, or a statistic or whatever, anything you use that comes from some source, quote the source. Basically, 7 papers in 7 weeks, 2 questions per paper make 14 questions. 1 point per question makes 14 points. To pass, you have to have, at least in the German system, 1, 2, 3, 4. 5 is not. So this is the way. If you get less than 7 points, you don't pass. 7 to 8 points, you're 4. 9 to 10, you're 3. 11 to 12, you have 2. 13 to 14, you have 1. And I know that we have some students from other university, except beside Frankfurt. So what we could do for you is, if you want to do the assignments, if you pass the assignments, we can give you a certificate that you pass this course. This is 6 credit points of our university, but then it's your responsibility to talk to your university to see whether they accept this as credit points. You are on the road, meaning this is really a journey. If you want, because we don't have a lot of time, but we have, let's say, a few minutes. If you have questions, because I see that we have a number of people that are still there. I can see some of the question in the chat. So if you want to give some feedback, you can certainly do that. I see you're doing it. I'm trying to see whether there's any question that are interesting. Todo is basically saying, we will send you the Google Docs today. And the question here is from Vincent Mai: is the homework also available to non-students who would like to do them with or without correction? Oh, we didn't think about it. We thought that we only thought about it us correcting. But I would say, if you are interested in receiving the questions because you're interested in having a look, I think you should probably send an email to us and say explicitly, can I also receive the question? And we'll be happy to send it to you because we already have them. So it might be useful for you or for some other things. So another question is, do we get the Google Doc? No, you get the link and Todo will send an email. Tomorrow, Emmanuel Goffey will discuss, among other things, exactly this kind of dilemma. For example, the runaway train dilemma. So I'm grateful that we have an expert on that. Okay, I see somebody that says, connection to current COVID-19 tracing apps very relevant in this context. Absolutely. I think what we should do is we have a couple of slots that are still in preparation. I think we should really make sure that we will cover that because it's all over the place. This is really a good question because it's raising a lot of interesting questions. The benefit versus, for example, the possible problem in privacy. I'm scanning. I think there's a long list. I think this is basically mainly the area that we have. I have to mention something that I just realized now, and I'm sorry about that, but I forgot to start the recording. So there will be no recording of my lecture. So unfortunately, the idea was to do that, but I forgot about it. So for those people that did not attend or they want to have a rehearsal, there will be only copy of the presentation that are already online, but there is not the lecture per se. Is unfortunately, I realize it now, and I'm apologizing for that because the idea that for each lecture we do a recording and we put it on YouTube. And somebody's asking for possibility of half points. We did not see that, but Todo is also replying to say we could potentially give half points. Yes. Let me see if there's any more question. Once somebody's asking maximum 1 page for 1 question or 2 questions, the answer was maximum 1 page for 1 question. And then somebody said, one of my friends might be interested in the course, but learning about it late. Could he join as a registered student at this point? This is something that we'll need to discuss with Todo because we have the only issue that we have is that the Zoom license that we have allows up to 100 people. Today, we did not have 100 people, barely, so there was not a problem. But if you have a friend, I would say you send an email with the name and the email, and if it's a student that needs the credit points or not, and me and Todo will decide. I also see that somebody said, Maremi Dion, they say, Felix recorded. Oh, that would be amazing. So if this Felix could contact us, Felix, do not upload it on YouTube, but basically talk to us because we have a YouTube channel that we can use it for that. I see there is a Felix H. So if this Felix H would be emailing to me and Todo at the email that we said, we can then take the recording and put it on the YouTube of the course. So, but thank you, because that's really nice that you recorded. And I would say, unless there is the last question, you have time for a last question? Okay, Sally said, okay, I will send you an email, which is great. And somebody said, is there any topic about deepfakes and the harm of AI trust? Yes, there will be lectures on AI trust on that, and you see in the schedule in the middle. I would say thank you, everybody, for listening, and especially thank you, Felix, that I don't know, but that recorded, so because then, you know, people that did not have the chance to attend live could listen the presentation. And enjoy your day. And as you see, you are on the road. Thank you very much.